So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay on one of the many mini updates that have been happening. And interestingly enough, this battle is actually one where I'm not technically on the correct version of the game because it's very difficult to keep track of which version each replay actually took place on, given that there are so many, and given that I am intermittently not here, it makes it very, very hard. However, I feel as though this is actually going to be fine because most of the tweaking between the various little mini updates that have been happening of late have concerned the Nalgrim directly. In fact, by the time this replay comes out, I imagine the public version of the build will be out, so this will prove to be hopefully less of a problem in the coming weeks. But like I said, the only differences I believe in the game files are actually to do with the Nalgrim, and the Nalgrim are not a part of this particular battle. We've seen them in the last three Silmarillion ones, so it's time for a little bit of a change. This is also a very quick battle in many ways because this is going to be the last one that I feel comfortable in being able to actually record shortly before, in all probability, being sent away due to work-related things. So this is actually this is me recording something after a day of work. So I apologise if I sound a little bit fatigued, but it is what it is. This should hopefully give me the wiggle room I need to be able to maintain my current schedule, and it also gives us an opportunity to look at some of the Elven factions that we haven't seen in a little while in Silmarillion. By some I mean Gondolin specifically, because we have seen the other three that are involved in this particular battle somewhat recently. We're going to be seeing three of the lighter Elven factions as well, with the Avari joining Gondolin on Team Purple, and the red team going to be made up of Ossiriand and Mithrim, both of which with their very nasty archer force. This is of course the Dry Lake Bed as well, a bit of a classic map. It's one that we haven't seen in quite a while, and it has a somewhat different vibe, to be fair, with the Silmarillion updated vegetation stuff, the gnarled trees and such. They look a little bit swamp-like actually, which makes them seem very sinister in a desert, I would say, but maybe that's intentional. Yeah, Dry Lake Bed, it's one of the classic more open maps, which is a little bit more interesting than the grassy plain, and it's been a while since we've seen this one actually, so makes a good opportunity to actually see this one again, seeing as it was one that that was sort of a regular occurrence in many ways. Now then, we shall start off with the purple team, with Gondolin, because Gondolin are a bit of a fan favourite in the game. Naturally, I mean, Gondolin in the lore, people like them, and also I think they've done a really good job with the various unit models for Gondolin, making each one distinct to represent each of the houses that make up the faction. Starting off here, Waffles playing as them. Marksman of the Heavenly Arch, the heavy archer that Gondolin have, one of the best single archers for skirmishing with the enemy in the game. They are, however, very expensive, as most of Gondolin's upper tier units are going to be. And you can't really mass them up in the same way that you can with other archers that are intended for skirmishing, so there is potentially a bit of a trade-off there. I wouldn't say Gondolin are going to be the best at sitting and shooting with long-range heavy archers in the game, simply because they can't bring the Heavenly Arch marksman in maybe the numbers they would want, but certainly against these kind of oppositions, Mithrim and Ossiriand, both of them are going to try and leverage their archers pretty heavily, but neither of them are going to have access to the kind of heavy archers that Gondolin can. So in the event that you do need to engage in a skirmish fight, at least temporarily, which is very likely in this matchup, not too surprising to see the Marksman of the Heavenly Arch here. It's also not surprising to see the Spearmen of the Swallow as well as a result of this. They are of course the lighter archer that Gondolin have available to them. They double up as Spearmen in melee as well, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for cavalry to get in and amongst them in the traditional way that you would try to against enemy archers. Not going to be quite so dominant in a skirmish fight this, but then the same could be said of the archers that they're facing off against really, so it just helps to bulk out their skirmish line. Two units of artillery. We've got the Halberd men of the Gate of Silva, which is a new unit I believe that was added in the most recent patch. Obviously Halberdiers, very nice for Gondolin to have a phalanx unit such as this. You can see they are in and amongst the armourers of the Hammer, which is an interesting choice because they are a very expensive line infantry unit, and their focus being armour piercing means they're going to be good against very select units from both Mithrim and Ossiriand, rather than being generally very effective as they would be against the Nalgrim, for example, or Angband. So an interesting addition there. I think the idea behind this Gondolin army is that he's brought basically one of every kind of unit that's possible to bring with a single composition. The Gallants of the White Wing are a fairly commonplace line infantry unit that we've seen. They are effectively the sword version of upper end line infantry that Gondolin have, so they should be pretty good in this particular matchup for the reasons mentioned previously. Obviously more likely armoured foes they're facing off against. We have Spearmen of the Gate of Stone pushing a ballista, again two-handed spears. They may not have the armour or the armour piercing that the Halberdiers pushing the Trebuchet have. But having said that, they are still a bit of a strange unit to try and get at. I mean, you know, a lot of the time we're used to artillery crews being kind of a non-event really. They can be cannon fodder once the artillery has used up its ammo, but in Silmarillion things are a little bit different. Some factions have got access to actually some very powerful units that utilise their artillery, and Gondolin are amongst those. Axemen of the Pillar, more of a medium line infantry unit this, but one-handed axemen should be pretty good against lightly armoured foes such as the ones they are facing off against here. Again, kind of an interesting army build this from Gondolin based on the fact that he's tried to bring one of everything he can. So it's not going to be a full line of Axemen of the Pillar, so you've got a front line of line infantry that is of various levels of quality and various focuses that they have. So Axemen of the Pillar should be pretty good on an individual level. Scouts of the Tree, slingers with their armour-piercing projectiles, very low base damage, but the armour-piercing does help them out quite a lot. Interesting to see what sort of foes they're going to try and focus down. Obviously the enemy archers will be able to outrange them, so it's going to have to be we're going to have to use them quite well here, Waffles, in order to get the most out of them. Guardsmen of the Harp are basically the most basic unit of line infantry unit that Gondolin can field. Basic swordsmen, but they should be pretty good in this matchup, to be fair. Pretty efficient, especially when you combine them with some of the more elite units that they are alongside. Another technically line infantry unit, but a bodyguard tier 1 for Gondolin's level. Retainers of the King, very, very good, and going to be difficult for the foes across the way to try and face in melee. But like I said, I feel as though the red team are going to try and leverage their ranged assets as much as they can against Gondolin. I mean, to be fair, being hyper-aggressive against Gondolin wouldn't necessarily be the worst idea when they brought 3 artillery pieces like this. Axemen of the Gate of Bronze here, obviously not a long weapon unit like the other 2 artillery crews are, but very able to defend themselves in melee with those axes, especially against lightly armoured foes. Shield Bearers of the Tower are a nice defensive spear unit, and in and amongst them the Lords of the Golden Flower, which I think, based on all the factions that are on display today, this is the most powerful possible infantry unit that can be brought. 3 HP. They also have a bonus against monstrous units, so if the Ents are present, they'll want to avoid the Lords of the Golden Flower if they can. Shield Bearers of the Tower, of course, defensive in nature. We have the Champions of the Fountain, which, again, a very nice unit of, I believe they are the Relentless Heavy Swordsmen, if I'm remembering this correctly. So they're going to be able to attack through enemy attacks and not get staggered, essentially. Very nice. Going to be a big problem, potentially, for the red team. And finally, the Knights of the Golden Flower, as far as lances go, one of, if not the scariest unit of such in the game as it stands. Again, good against monsters, good at charging into infantry, as all lances of this tier are going to be. And on wide open maps like this, who knows? Could be a painful old time, this, for the red team. I mean, it's a bit of an all over the place kind of army with one of everything, essentially. But still a difficult thing for the red team to face, because Gondolin just in general has got a lot of good answers to most of what the red team can bring. The Avari is going to be his ally, Captain Gervais. He's got the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, because of course the single entity artillery-esque units that the Avari and Nandan Gorthab have, they might be micro-intensive, but they can also be incredibly useful. Considering the more lightly armoured nature of their foes today as well, should be pretty effective if they manage to shoot into blobs. The Bow Wards of the Darkling Woods are basic as far as spears go, but this is kind of what the Avari have as an initial front line, and then they try to do hit and runs with various units, chief among which, or among one of the most dominant units for this, is going to be the Thorn Casters of Tor and Dwenath. Kind of similar to how slingers work in many ways. I mean, they don't do damage too quickly with their ranged attacks, but it will add up over time, and also they're surprisingly resilient. It's going to be a little bit more tricky for you to focus them down with archers and burn them down quickly. Ossiriand and Mithrim are factions which are going to be able to do the damage quicker than most, but even so, these tree units for the Avari are where their survivability comes in. A lot of their standard elven units are a little bit flimsy, but they're not Ents, but the tree class units are where they get a little bit tankier. Bow Wards of the Darkling Woods, once again, just in behind. We also have some Stone Hewers of the Darkling Woods, which effectively the most basic standard line infantry unit that the Avari can bring. Again, these one-handed axemen should be good against the foes they're facing, but the Avari have got more in common actually with the red team armies than their fellow blue team army on this occasion, so I don't know. Interesting to see how the Stonehewers will trade with the Ossiriand over on this side of the field. The Host of the Withered Ash, again, two-handed spear unit, not dissimilar to the Ballista crew over in Gondolin. Not quite as dominant in these engagements as pikes can be. Having said that, they offer a much-needed anchor for the Avari line. If the Avari do have to commit themselves to an elongated engagement, then this is one of the units that they need to base their efforts around. Bow Wards of the Darkling Woods again, Shades of the Guarded Path, once again, the upper end, effectively the best unit of infantry they can bring. It may only be single HP, but a bodyguard tier unit by the Avari's standards. One-handed axemen, like I said, so they should do very nicely against the vast majority of infantry they're going to be facing off against today. And finally over here we've got a couple of units of the Thorned Ancients of Torham Duinath, which are the infantry-focused tree unit that the Avari can bring. Effectively like trolls, only they trade in damage for survivability. They're a weird kind of unit, this, but this is the kind of matchup where I think they would be pretty useful, honestly, for just really annoying the enemy skirmishers, given that is what the red team are very likely going to try and utilise to their advantage. Now then, Ossiriand, played by Tundra's Fox. He has got some skirmishers of Rathloriel, I say some skirmishers of Rathloriel, a lot of skirmishers of Rathloriel to make up his initial line. Now Ossiriand have got a lot of units that can hide, so I imagine we're going to see most of their units pop into existence once the battle has already begun. You can see immediately here what Ossiriand's initial plan is going to be. They know they've got the ranged edge on the Avari, and they know that the Avari are going to be not great against even the more basic Ossiriand archers, so this is what they're going to try and leverage against them. Ossiriand can hide as well, of course. The Avari can hide as well as Ossiriand, so this could end up being a matter of who can move their assets around and keep units hidden away from enemy skirmishers best. I mean, Ossiriand starts off with more of a comfortable position because of all of these archers, but if things do get a little bit messy against the tree units of the Avari, Ossiriand can find themselves with nowhere really to go. Having said that, Earthen End Tower, a couple of units of them, well I say that, a detachment and a full unit. This is going to be a unit which, again, the armour-piercing axes make them a more difficult foe to try and shut down in melee. Important still to do so, because if you can, you should be looking to shut down enemy skirmishers before they use up all their ammunition. But yeah, the Earthen End Tower, kind of a must-bring for Ossiriand in most matchups, even against more lightly armoured foes. They're fantastic, heavier archers. Of course, they're going to be more able to defend themselves than most of the Ossiriand skirmish force. Back here, the General's unit is going to be the Kinsmen of Denethor, which, again, by Ossiriand standards, is one of their heavier units. Single HP, but heavy spearmen. Reasonably durable unit to put your General in. So the Avari will be hoping to try and take him out if they can. And the Ents over here, we mentioned earlier that the Golden Flower units are very good against monstrous units. And that's what the Ents are. The Ents, of course, Elephant class, very dangerous if they get in and amongst the Avari, but the Avari have got plenty of units that can take care of them. Mostly their throwing projectile units should be pretty good at shutting down the Ents quickly. So again, timing is going to be very key for Tundra's Fox and how he decides to use the Ents. And finally, last but by no means least, we have Stewie, who is playing as the Grey Elves of Mithrim. Now, I've seen Mithrim quite a lot lately, and they've got very, very good long-range archers, which means Gondolin, to be fair, I think with all of their artillery, Gondolin will be okay if Mithrim decide to try and keep themselves at arm's length. There'll be an interesting conundrum here to see if those 3 artillery pieces are worth it if Mithrim do decide to hold back. Elves of the Twilight Hearth are the heaviest of the Mithrim archers. Combined with a spear on their back, they're a very good all-round unit, and they will be attempting, of course, to whittle Gondolin down. 2 units of them should be enough to counteract 1 unit of Marksman of the Heavenly Arch, I would suggest. Just in behind we've got some Outlaws of Hithlum, which of course have their throwing projectiles. If they can get in close to Gondolin, they could be the sort of thing to really help the lighter Mithrim infantry units equalise against that Gondolin quality that I'm expecting to see. Hunters of Mithrim, kind of similar again with their javelins, a sort of multi-layered, almost entirely skirmish-focused force here, which, considering how quick this battle is likely to be once it gets underway, I assume this is going to be a fairly violent affair right from the off, which means I don't think we're going to see too much of a initial skirmish, which suits some armies on the field that we've seen so far better than others. Sword Bearers of Mithrim, if they can get in and amongst, I mean, they're a perfectly fine unit of line infantry, but going up against Gondolin, it is a whole different level. I mean, you could look at them and compare them to something like the Guardsmen of the Heart, but as soon as you compare them to something like the Gallants of the White Wing or the Retainers of the King, they end up looking quite wanting, but then Gondolin do pay for all that quality. Mithrim should have the edge in terms of numbers here as a result. The Hewing Guildsmen of Androth are one area where Mithrim can be quite scary to Gondolin. They've got really, really savage attack power, and that should be enough to worry a lot of the Gondolin units. Whether they have enough of this particular unit remains to be seen, but if Mithrim do want to contest the melee fight, then they're going to need to rely on a unit such as that. And the Scions of Tuor as well, which are a very lightly armoured but very, very dangerous unit of armour-piercing bodyguard tier infantry. Exactly the sort of thing which could be a real concern for going up against Gondolin. Or Gondolin. Gondolin will be concerned about them, certainly. Anyway, Mithrim may have a couple of hidden units here and there as well. Not as much as Ossiriand perhaps, but they should be around somewhere. Regardless, I don't think there's going to be much need for a cut here, so let's get right into it, shall we? Now, even though I usually don't sing the praises of bringing this much artillery, I do think that Gondolin, in spite of their very unorthodox army here, do represent a pretty significant challenge here for the Grey Elves of Mithrim. Now, one thing that Mithrim should, in theory, have in their favour is their ability to, and there you can see the skipping projectile of the trebuchet here as it goes bouncing off into the far distance, but as I was just about to say, one thing that Mithrim should have in their favour is the ranged fight, but having so much in the way of artillery does actually bring that somewhat into question, as, well, Gondolin can simply do so much damage with 3 artillery pieces that even though they should have the edge with their archers, it shouldn't end up mattering. And then, of course, it comes down to a battle of sheer muscle in melee, and that is where Gondolin are going to be very difficult for Mithrim to defeat. Now, it's kind of a similar story over here, albeit I think Ossiriand have got a slight natural edge over the Avari, because not everything in the Avari, you can see actually that the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, I should say, is one thing that Ossiriand do have to contend with, but not everything the Avari have can hide, ultimately. And Ossiriand should be able to take pretty decent advantage of that as the battle goes along. But like I said, I mean, this isn't really going to be an elongated fight, you would imagine. So as much as I'm talking about how the skirmish here could end up being won by one side or the other, someone somewhere is probably going to force an engagement at some point in the relatively early stages of this battle, I would suggest, with the Elders of the Twilight Hearth moving around to the flank here, trying to do a little bit of damage in the initial trading of ammunition. But the Marksmen of the Heavenly Arch and Spearmen of the Swallow both are going to force Mithrim into maybe taking a slightly different tactic. Ossiriand move forward. I mean, Ossiriand are far closer actually to Gondolin than they are to the Avari, and this is another thing the Avari have to keep in mind. Ossiriand, they don't necessarily need to play into the Avari's kiting backwards too much if they decide to join with their ally in Mithrim and trying to 2v1 Gondolin quickly. Having said that, with the Scouts of Galleon moving around the flank, plenty of these Spear Host of Galleon, there's also the Ondo Hyando getting knocked over by the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, but lots of them are also getting back up, but not insubstantial losses being suffered here by Ossiriand, so both Mithrim and Ossiriand are having to deal with the extreme nature of the artillery-focused builds that their opponents have brought, with Ballistae and Trebuchets also doing their thing. Spearmen of the Swallow. One thing that I'm noticing as well here is the fact that Mithrim are not necessarily doing all that much to actually return fire, so maybe they are trying to get into close range and use their javelins and their throwing axes and such, and that will force Gondolin into a different tactic, to be sure. Trebuchet doing some good damage there to the Hunters of Mithrim as well. It's the sort of thing which they can't simply keep up forever. Outlaws of Hithlum moving forward. We can see some units on the flank, Scouts of Galleon, so now we should start to see the very significant Ossiriand skirmishing force start to impress itself upon the Avari. And there you can see the bow wards of the Darkling Woods starting to take some hits. The Thorn Casters should be pretty good at withstanding a lot of this damage. Having said that, the Ondo Hyando are going to be also good at carving through that high armour that they have. Trebuchet going to shoot at point blank. Still, I'm not entirely sure about what the... I mean, they're firing with their Elders of the Twilight Hearth now, but this is a rather high-risk strategy, this from Mithrim, because they're parking themselves right in front of Gondolin here. This could end up paying off if their archers can do the damage necessary. I mean, the Bane of the Incomers in particular could be nasty if Gondolin decide to keep themselves in this relatively tight formation. And it may be here that this battle is almost entirely dependent on ranged units. It's a very different battle to the ones I usually show, which are of course are longer sieges. And in such situations we very often see the really long infantry engagements, but it's not going to be the case here. I mean, Mithrim, they are moving forward, but I still can't help but feel as though even when the ranged fighters join, they're not going to do all that well here, with Gondolin doing their thing. We also have the Knights of the Golden Flower charging in, and they should be able to do a lot of damage off the charge to these sword bearers. Hewing Guildsmen, they are, like I mentioned, by far and away the most dangerous Mithrim infantry unit that Gondolin will have to deal with, but if they can try and deal with them with their artillery and what ranged units they have, then certainly in terms of sheer might in melee, this battle should only end one way. In come the Gallants of the White Wing, who I mentioned in the deployment phase should be pretty good against any sort of infantry that either the Grey Elves or the Green Elves can bring. This is a little bit of a worry though. Outlaws of Hithlum throwing in the ballista crew, which, I mean, like I mentioned, the artillery crews themselves are actually worth going after, not only to try and stop the artillery, but also because the infantry that's actually manning it is worthwhile for the Gondolin faction. You can see here though that the artillery is now starting to be felled by the throwing projectiles. I'd just say that maybe it took a little bit too long for this to be the case, and now Gondolin with their Guardsmen of the Heart, there we can hear the other trebuchet crumble as well. This is a very frenetic battle, this, so I'm not blaming the players for losing micro and individual units here and there, but has been a very bizarre thing. The Bane of the Incomers also going to be firing in. Champions of the Fountain are back here. Catapult. I mean, not much of Gondolin can afford to be left uncommitted because of the relatively small size of their army. The Bane of the Incomers, of course, firing in, kind of Hwacha-esque in the way that they work. Not exactly a one-to-one comparison, but fairly close. But this is going to be a bit of a problem here, as Bane of the Incomers is going to be one of the things that the Mithrim Elves are going to be pretty dependent on to do quite well in this battle, but if they end up getting flattened by the Golden Flower Knights, that's going to be a real shame for them. Bane of the Incomers are fairly fragile in melee as well, as I have observed. I mean, they're useful in melee, but not a bulwark that you can depend upon. Meanwhile, you see here skirmishers of Rathloriel moving forward, still trading of shots. I mean, they don't necessarily want this fight at mid-range, because that's where the Avari start to come into their own as a skirmishing faction. I can't help but feel as though the Green Elves want to keep this fight a little bit further afield. Randirim and Tol Galen revealing themselves, but Rangers are a little bit less of a concern on a more open battlefield such as this. Skirmishers of Rathloriel taking some hits here from the Thorn Casters, and too much waiting around for my liking in this battle so far. I mean, yes, these skirmishers are out of ammunition. Maybe you could make the case for them being used for absorbing ammunition, but I feel as though just closing them down would be a better choice on this occasion. I don't know though, because Ossiriand themselves maybe don't have the kind of infantry mass that would be required to actually make that stick. Second unit of Bane of the Incomers as well, so a very archer-heavy army with 2 units of Twilight Hearth Elders and 2 units of the Incomers makes it very clear to see what Mithrim were doing, or attempting to do, and that's not too surprising. I mean, trying to go toe-to-toe in a battle of pure might against Gondolin is something few factions can get away with doing. Mithrim not really one of them for the most part. Armourers of the Hammer moving in alongside the Champions of the Fountain, 2 very, very high tier units, and the Halberdiers are in here as well. The Hunters of Mithrim are 2-handed spears, so they won't crumble as quickly maybe as Gondolin would like, but they will be forced aside without too many problems, I would imagine. A much more significant Mithrim force here on the flank, but again, all of this Gondolin infantry, too much for the sword bearers. Do we have anything in the way of... Yeah, I mean, the Hewing Guildsmen should do okay against the Axemen of the Pillar over here. The Shield Bearers of the Tower are not the most damaging unit, but they can be very, very difficult to bring down from the front. But the Scions of Tuor are in here, but they're looking fairly depleted already. Does the cavalry have something to do with this, perhaps? I mean, this is a real problem for Mithrim. They can't afford to be taking this kind of devastating charge from these Gondolin knights. And this is the sort of thing which may end up sealing their fate, which is also a sign maybe that Ossiriand do need to pick up the pace a little bit against the Avari. This is where the Avari's kiting tactics should start to come into their own if they continue to move backwards, use some of these Darkling Woods units as a sort of ablative armour for their throwing projectiles in behind, then maybe they can do some good work. I mean, you'd imagine the Stonehewers should do okay against the skirmishers of Rathloriel. I mean, certainly the Shades of the Garlic Path will, and unsurprisingly, already they are shaken. Stabilising for now, but I don't know for how much longer. I mean, this is the kind of situation the Avari do like to be in, where the enemy have to come towards them. A few units being left behind though. Bloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark. Dangerous unit in terms of their ability to deal damage, but a little bit isolated perhaps here on the flank. A little bit of a chaotic fight so far. Thorned Ancients of Tor and Dwenath here on the flank as well, alongside these Gloom Hunters. Maybe going to try and push in, deal with these Scouts of Gellion. Randirim are back here. Whatever happened to the Ents? They're still here, but the time for the Ents being committed may very well be closing. That's the kind of unit you can't really afford to do nothing with in these kind of situations. A singular catapult remains, but Retainers of the King are in here. Still, with the Elves of the Twilight Hearth in this section of the front line, again, Mithrim can hold for a decent length of time, but I don't really feel as though it's going to come to anything in the end, because they're not going to be able to do much damage in return. Bane of the Incomers here trying to last Samurai, the Knights of the Golden Flower, but you can see how resilient the Knights are. I mean, yes, relatively speaking, not actually that much time has passed because of the kind of battle that it is, but the Knights of the Golden Flower having free run of the backfield in a 2v2 field battle like this can be the sort of thing which is very decisive, especially against a Mithrim army which is so archer heavy, such as the one that Stewie has brought. Still, I mean, to be fair, these Bane of the Incomers are holding the attention of the Knights of the Golden Flower for a fairly lengthy period of time. Scions of Tuor, in spite of the fact that they are outnumbered, and also with the Lords of the Golden Flower in here now as well, a fairly ideal counter for them. If it had just been the Shield Bearers of the Tower in here, I would have fancied Mithrim's chances of actually doing quite well on this flank, but as it is, those Lords of the Golden Flower are one of the scariest units of infantry that the game has to offer. They may even get a chance to use their anti-monster bonus if the Ents make their way over here. Axemen of the Pillar on their own though, they are actually losing ground now. You can see here that I think that is actually the Mithrim General, but with the Hewing Guildsmen alongside some of the more basic swordsmen, this is one area in which Mithrim are making ground against one of the more basic Gondolin infantry units, but I don't necessarily know for how much longer that's going to be the case. Gallants of the White Wing fighting back to back with the other unit of the Elders of the Twilight Hearth coming in to sandwich them. So I mean, Mithrim are doing okay over here, but this is where most of their infantry was concentrated after all. It's on this front line I would worry for them, because they're entirely dependent on their long spears holding the line for as long as possible, and that isn't really going to happen when you consider that Gondolin also have halberdiers of their own, and the sheer quality of their infantry on this front line is going to prove to be an issue as well. Bane of the Incomers having used up their ammunition. That is one thing you can say about Mithrim. A lot of their high-end skirmishers do seem to have used their ammunition, which is something in their favour. We shall see. And a point-blank shot from the catapult right up the line. Do they have anything that they can commit? Yes, they do, but they're having to pull Elders of the Twilight Hearth off the front line, which could end up making their front line fall apart in return. Branch Stalkers of the Green Sea, a unit we haven't actually seen before for the Avari, using their twin axes to bring down an already depleted unit of skirmishers of Rathloriel. Over here we can see the Stonehewers in conjunction with the Bow Wards again bring down these skirmishers. Another very... It's weird because they're an archer heavy... It was an archer heavy build by both Mithrim and Ossiriand, and yet by default really they've been forced into being more aggressive than I think they would have chosen to be. In Ossiriand's case, it can be difficult to skirmish with the Avari because they can choose to remain hidden, but they were hastened, I think, by the struggling of their ally, and that may very well have determined quite a lot in this battle. Spear Host of Gellion doing okay. alongside the Earthen End Tower over here. I mean, the Earthen End Tower should do quite nicely against these Thorned Ancients, but they are running roughshod all over Ossiriand's back lines at this point. Having a look at the percentage of kills, as you would expect, the blue team doing quite nicely. I think as a case study for bringing an archer-centric army and then being forced into being far more aggressive than you originally wanted to be, it can show how things can get out of control pretty quickly here. The Ents moving in. I think we can afford to go up to ×1 speed now, to be honest. And the Ents will do a lot of damage. I mean, a lot of the Avari's army is not really built for bringing down units like this. Rangers of the Hidden Path, really one of the exceptions there. Host of the Withered Ash doing well on the front line against the Kinsmen of Denethor. Again, alongside the Shades of the Guarded Path, the Avari can put up a pretty decent front line. It isn't their first port of call, but certainly it has proven to be a big part of their tactics here. Hunts of Mithrim are running. The Bane of the Incomers are firing back now at the front line as Gondolin are victorious here on the front. Not really a great surprise. The Elves of the Twilight Hearth are over here facing off against the Axemen of the Gate of Bronze. But the Axemen themselves giving as good as they get, to be honest, and that's, again, one of the benefits. Maybe that is why Gondolin went for 3 artillery pieces, because they knew Mithrim may have the edge in terms of sheer archers, so they wanted to have some sort of range presence. But even if it all went pear-shaped for their artillery early on, those units are still useful in melee, and that's not something you can say, not to this extent anyway, for every faction. Gondolin do have that in their favour, perhaps. Shield Bearers of the Tower, also the Golden Flower still pretty healthy. I mean, one thing, the Knights of the Golden Flower at this point are heavily depleted, but it's because they've been charging into the Mithrim ranks fairly consistently throughout this fight, and it's made life next to impossible, really, for Mithrim, as I mentioned. Being forced forwards by the artillery, having too many of their archers exposed to enemy cavalry, their infantry wasn't up to the task of facing what Gondolin had up their sleeve. The Axemen should be overwhelmed now by this pocket of Mithrim resistance, but I don't think it's going to make too much of a difference. Spear Host of Galleon, the unit of the Branch Stalkers, should be enough to bring them down. You can see here the Ents have fallen, and a very large part of that will have been, we may have missed it, but it will have been because of the Rangers of the Hidden Path now used up all their ammunition, coming in from the side to help deal with the lightly armoured Spear Host. And the Avari, not a great deal of armour piercing in their roster, but a lot of units that are savage in melee at dealing with lightly armoured troops, so again that's an area in which Ossiriand have struggled. This is how the Avari are meant to be played, after all. Enemy attack into you and then you can ruthlessly exploit any weaknesses you can perceive. Granted, I think, while Captain Gervais has certainly done that, there was nothing to really force Ossiriand into moving forward other than their allies struggling initially. So, taking advantage of the circumstances most certainly. Earthen End Tower fairly depleted at this point. The Randirim shooting along the Avari line, or at least attempting to, but they're not having an easy time of it. There goes the Ossiriand general as well, so I can't imagine things are going to improve too much. There goes the Avari general as well, though, so one last spit in the eye. Gondolin completely victorious against Mithrim now, chasing off the units that were around the catapult, so, I mean, this is really where the seeds of the blue/purple team's victory were sown, you have to say. Rangers of the Hidden Path, I mean, really at this point it's just cleaning up the exposed Ossiriand units. I think the Earthen End Tower over here are actually going to be the last unit left fighting. Maybe some skirmishes of Wrath L'Oreal as well. Earthen End Tower fighting on the front line again against all of these tree units. Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth still alive, running around as he is. And yeah, this is going to be it. It's obviously a fairly dominant victory here for the blue team, but a worthwhile one to show, because it's been quite a while since we've done a case study-esque battle like this. And I would imagine actually here that this is going to be a admit defeat at this point, because I don't think the Earthen End Tower would rout in this situation, although maybe I'm wrong. No, yeah, it's going to be an admit defeat here from Tundra's Fox, but it's fair enough at this point. Really all you're doing is just waiting for disaster to strike. And there we have it. Victory for Gondolin and the Avari. And like I said, this really, you can tell based on the compositions that Tundra and Stewie brought. They didn't really want to be aggressive, like both of them, understandably, for Ossiriand and Mithrim, went archer heavy, but perhaps that in lies some of the problem, in that Gondolin and the Avari kind of know what to expect from this situation. Maybe it would have been a little bit more of a surprise, maybe, if Mithrim went fully infantry focused, because if they had, I don't think Gondolin would have had the numbers nor the real composition to actually deal with that effectively. They would have been very heavily reliant on their Knights of the Golden Flower to carry the day, which they did very well in this battle for sure, but I don't know whether they would have been able to do so if Mithrim was a little bit more prepared in that regard for them. Throwing projectiles, yes, but maybe trading in the archers would have been the way forward. But we saw an example there of really your own composition coming back to haunt you, and early on with the artillery from Gondolin, the stage for this battle was set, and Tundra could only really react to this if he'd stayed back and tried to go for the longer term battle, which, like I said, not everything from the Avari can hide. If Ossiriand was allowed to play that slow game of pushing them back with their superior range, it would have been very difficult for the Avari to respond to that without some very clever initial positioning in the deployment from Captain Gervais. But yeah, in the end, it didn't really go to plan for either of the two red team armies here and the blue team, both actively with artillery and compositions and reactively in terms of just picking off the enemy as they came forward. I have to say that they certainly deserved their victory here. Gondolin, I think, were the catalyst for this because their composition was very difficult for Mithrim to have to deal with. Nice to see sort of this one of everything kind of composition actually work out for Gondolin as well, because that's the kind of thing that you want to see work for Gondolin. Like individual, unique, as it were, retinues of units coming together to form a very versatile but a very dominant army. Lords of the Golden Flower, very good in melee, especially given that they were going up against the most dangerous of the Mithrim infantry as well in the Scions of Tuor. Gallants of the White Wing were good on the front line, as you would expect. They're pretty much the best kind of line infantry you can have against a force like Mithrim, I should say. Axemen of the Pillar actually did quite well, considering they were one of the ones that were put under the most pressure. Catapults, I mean, Trebuchet didn't get that many kills, but I mean, the Ballista, Catapult and Trebuchet did what they had to by forcing Mithrim to come forward. I mean, if they would have got more kills if Mithrim had stayed back. Other units, Guardsmen of the Heart doing quite well for such a basic unit. The archers didn't, again, much like the artillery, maybe didn't have the time necessarily to lay down as much damage as they otherwise would have. Scouts the Tree doing quite nicely, but of course the MVP for Gondolin, and perhaps the most significant unit on the whole field, to be honest with you, in terms of what they were actually doing and accomplishing, were the Knights of the Golden Flower. I mean, Mithrim with their backlines exposed, it was a grisly sight, and they certainly took advantage of that ruthlessly. So yeah, an interesting one. Like I said, this is a shorter battle because I'm recording this one after work, and you know, there's a very real chance that this will be the last chance I get to record before I'm sent away for an elongated period of time, so I wanted to get as much in the bank as I possibly could so that I don't have to compromise my schedule at all unless I'm sent away for the full 3 weeks. I have achieved that. I mean, full 3 weeks, and I think I actually would, for the first time in a long time, miss out on a video slot that I usually do, but I will communicate that if that is the case, but I don't think that will be true. But either way, I've done the best that I can to make sure that I maintain my current schedule. Also sliding a little bit of extra Silmarillion content in here as well to go alongside the glut of sieges I'm going to have for Reforged, which were sent to me by a combination of Winged Swordsman 44 and the Womb Raider, so big thank you to those two. Long may this sort of continue as well, because like I was saying in the most recent channel update, I was a little bit worried about the amount of content, and you know, given where Reforged is, the next patch would inject some much needed life into the game, like I said, but it seems like there has been a bit of a resurgence irregardless of that, so that's nice to see. Like I said, by the time the next replays come out, it could be a few weeks in the future for me as well as you, for when I actually record next, but that will be what I do. Reforged, there will also be the brackets replays, like I said, well, replays, bracket videos. Want to do them a bit more. I would have done them already, but like I said, the schedule has made it so that I've just had to try and record as efficiently as I possibly can for the last few recording sessions, just to try and get that safety net, whereas the bracket ones, it's the sort of thing where I have to devote a fairly decent chunk of a day to in order to complete a video like that, and it's just not the sort of thing I've been able to do, whereas doing replays I've got down to a more efficient workflow, as it were. So it is what it is. Hopefully, like I said, this is not the sort of situation that will roll on forever, but we shall see on that front, won't we? Irregardless, that's sort of the vague plan. There is also the live stream channel update that I want to be doing at some point in the summer to sort of really nail down what's going to be happening, but I can't do that until I know for sure what's actually going to be happening, and while for a moment I thought I did, now I don't anymore. So it's again, it's one of those things. We'll have to wait and see, won't we? But yes, regardless of that, big thank you to Lord of Belagos once again for pointing... Actually, I think he did send this one to me a little bit more directly. But big thank you to Waffles for saving this one, and for all the players for being a part of it as well. Always interesting to have this, which is such a breath of fresh air really on the channel in comparison to all of the large-scale sieges that we normally traffic in here. But yes, like I said, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.